I will post it on my website, or we can post it perhaps on the Mid-Atlantic Industry Liaison Group's website in the event that you have colleagues or others who were unable to attend today, in the event that you find it useful and would like to share it with any of your colleagues. So again, my name is Dr. Jim Higgins. This webinar is intended to provide some practical guidance on analytical strategies that can help to facilitate a more effective analysis based on some of those changes from the revised scheduling letter, primarily around how to analyze data for individual ethnic groups, although this will talk broader than that. A little bit of information on me. I'm Jim Higgins, and I sent out the slides last night. If you didn't receive them, if you'd like to send me an email, I'd be happy to provide them to you. But I am a Senior Managing Director of the Higgins Group. My website is higginsgrp.com. I have a master's degree in industrial organizational psychology and a doctorate in educational psychology. And I've been doing this stuff for quite some time. I've taught statistics at the college level, and I've applied them in a variety of settings for business and government. Most of it has been, at least most of my early career was around the development and validation of pre-employment tests, a variety of different types of pre-employment tests. But probably over the last 10 years, I've been doing a lot of analyses, compensation analyses, to help federal contractors comply with OFCCP requirements. So anyway, you have this here. You can always visit my website if you'd like more information. If you'd like to contact me, you should see my phone number on the screen, 916-204-1749. And my website, of course, is there. If you want to contact me by email, contact me at ohiggins@surewest.net. I just changed web hosts, and as a result, I'm having a couple of issues with my business email. So in the next day or so, if you have any questions you want to ask me, please feel free to reach out to me at ohiggins@surewest.net. So an overview of today's presentation. Before I actually do that, I want to ask you if you could, just to confirm that you can see my screen and that you can hear me okay, could you shoot me, some of you could, if you could shoot me an email or a message through GoToMeetings chat, just to confirm that you can hear me. Okay, I'm getting some feedback. Yes, you can hear me. All right, just want to make sure that I'm not leaving anyone out there. Okay, and so incidentally, as we go through this presentation, please feel free to type any questions that you might have into the chat box. Originally, I wanted to do this as a GoToMeeting because an online meeting allows for dialogue between attendees, and it's a little bit easier to have live questions. But the number of people who expressed interest in the meeting, it exceeded the number of people who could actually attend my particular level of GoToMeeting account, and so that's why we changed it to a webinar. So you can still ask questions, and you can send them to the chat box. If it turns out if smaller groups would be interested in a discussion, we could always set up another meeting later on, and we could kind of continue our discussion in more of a live format. So with that in mind, when we get to the end, I'll try to answer any questions you may have. So what this presentation isn't versus what it is. Well, first off, I know any of you who have attended presentations of mine in the past, and it's been a while. I've been offline for just a while. I know that in the past I've given presentations on kind of an introduction to compensation analysis and kind of the basics, and I think that's pretty much been talked out. I think most people on the call are clear of why we do compensation analysis and what we're trying to answer. So this presentation isn't going to focus on trying to explain any of those things, but it's really going to be diving directly into some of the issues that we need to consider and how at least I approach compensation analysis now. So in terms of an overview of the presentation, briefly I want to talk about Item 19 of the scheduling letter. I want to talk a little bit about problems and promise, because I think some of the recent changes that have taken place, while they do lead to some potential problems for federal contractors, there's also some really good things about it as well, at least in my opinion. We're going to take a look back and conduct kind of an autopsy of multiple regression. You know, we've talked about that now for a number of years, and I, as well as many others, have been on the road trying to explain how to use multiple regression. So we're going to talk about, you know, did that work? What was right? What was wrong with it? And then we're going to move into why the OFCCP, which is actually superior, perhaps, in my opinion, to the previous strategy. And then specifically how to analyze compensation to address item 19. And I'm going to give you a practical example based on how I analyze compensation when I work with folks. So, oops, wrong way. So item 19. So this is kind of the guts of item 19, in my opinion, is that compensation data is now to be provided to the OFCCP at an individual level, rather than, you know, the typical group level that most of us have been used to in the past. So that's an important change. The focus on total compensation, most of the analyses that I've conducted in the past have been around annualized compensation. So there's this talk about total compensation, which raises some significant challenges to some organizations. It needs to include base salary and or wage rate and hours worked for all employees. Federal contractors also must submit other compensation, bonuses, incentives, commissions, merit increases, overtime for each employee, which, as I'll talk about later, raises some significant issues, because the assumption would be that one may need to run statistical analyses for the wide array of measures or types of compensation. And then finally, contractors need to include hire date, individual race, ethnicity, job title, job group, EEO category. And it's that individual race, ethnicity part that I think raises some of the biggest concerns as well, is because now in the past we looked at like whites versus minorities, and now the emphasis is on comparing individual ethnic groups, which adds a little spice to the mix in terms of how to pull a compensation analysis off. So the implication of this is that the analyses, however we conduct them, they're going to be much more granular. They're no longer going to be based on the aggregates of whites and minorities. And I think this is really significant. The OFCCP, if you figure, if they have employee level data, and especially if they map data, you know, from one contractor to the other, not only will they be able to run analytical screens of employer data to identify problems wherever they may exist, rather than relying on kind of high-level flags, they also could potentially kind of compare employers by basically mapping this data, you know, data to each other, kind of a big data scenario. So how does this affect federal contractors? Well, as I see it, there are some problems and some promises. So let's talk a little bit about the problems first. First off, that item 19 of the recent scheduling letter, it allows the OFCCP to apply greater scrutiny and flag potential violations, which is likely going to result in more audits, or at the very minimum, a lot more questions. It also increases the complexity of the analysis, especially if one looks at individual pay components for individual ethnic groups. So, you know, like I was saying, that in order to compare, say, whites and minorities, it's a fairly simple matter of running independent samples t-tests or multiple linear regression. And when you jump into this pool of having to compare more than two groups, the analysis is a lot more complex. It also requires more effort to identify and address problems, primarily because of having to compare multiple groups. But the promises are there as well. Now, this is going to sound like a contradiction in terms, but essentially what I would say is that the focus on individual ethnic groups is actually going to simplify the analysis in terms of identifying where a problem lies. Now, what do I mean by that? Essentially, by breaking out ethnic groups into individual groups, it's going to allow contractors to more granularly identify the source of potential pay problems. So, for example, if you had a job and you found that whether you're using group comparisons in a t-test or a multiple linear regression, if you found that there was a difference between whites and minorities, what did we typically do? Well, we tried to calculate estimated pay to, make sure people are paid what they should be paid. But the problem is by combining all of those ethnic groups together, what if it's just one ethnic group where the problem lies? And that when you combine that one ethnic group with the other ethnic groups, now suddenly you're having to weed through data from a whole bunch of people to try to find that needle in a haystack in terms of what is the source of the pay disparity. Now, another implication of this approach to analyzing compensation by individual ethnic group is that if you're able to identify the specific source, for example, let's say it's Asians and Pacific Islanders, that if that is the group where the pay disparity lies, then it's likely that you're going to have much fewer employees in that single group than all minorities together. And so as a result, you're able to more finely identify where do I need to conduct my cohort analysis? Where do I need to focus my efforts? And then as a result, because we're really breaking these individual minority groups out and looking at them individually, the result is likely to be that as you're comparing apples with apples, so to speak, that you're actually going to find fewer jobs with significant problems. In the analyses I've run to date with the approach that I'm going to be talking about today, that has in fact been the case. That by breaking them out, you're no longer having skewed data because of outliers of some ethnic group impacting the overall group of minorities. You basically eliminate a lot of problems. And then finally, that ability to focus in on the specific source of where the disparity comes from, and the fact that it's likely to involve far fewer people than the total number of minorities, it's going to result in lower liabilities to correct pay because you're only dealing with a smaller subset of people. So with that, I want to talk about multiple regression, a post-mortem. Now, you may recall that, I'm sure you recall that there's been a lot of pain involved with multiple regression, and a lot of people have had to sort of put on a statistician's hat. And so I myself have given more than a few presentations discussing multiple regression and raising terms like multicollinearity and homoscedasticity and trying to make people aware of some of the issues they need to take into account when running a multiple regression analysis. But it's probably pretty clear to everyone that multiple regression is powerful. It's a tool that is used in a variety of industries. Anytime you want to model how a number of variables impact another variable, multiple regression is the tool. So it's really a modeling statistical tool. And so our idea is we were trying to create models of how an employer pays its employees by taking various job-related factors that should drive pay, putting them all into this statistical test, and then trying to determine how they impact or predict pay, and then with that information trying to determine whether or not gender or ethnicity or minority status adds anything unique to that. But I want to ask the question, even though it's totally scientific, it's an awesome statistical test, and I love it, in terms of compensation analysis, how well does multiple regression really work in the field when you are applying it on a day-to-day basis on all your compensation analyses? I would postulate that it just didn't work as well as one might hope. And let me tell you why. Multiple linear regression has these assumptions that underlie its use, that in order for a multiple regression analysis to be valid and effective, it assumes that you're including all relevant variables in your model. So in other words, it means that when you are running your analysis, all of the significant variables that really impact pay, you've gathered them and you've included them. Furthermore, all irrelevant variables are excluded. So in other words, you have nothing in your model that really you can't show that it has any impact on pay. And typically that means that your explanatory factors are not statistically significant in the model. It also assumes you have adequate sample size. Now you recall that the OFCCP, they basically said that you had to have at least 30 people in your group, your pay analysis group, your similarly situated employee group, or your job title, whatever you want to call it, your unit of analysis. You need to have at least 30 people and then have at least 5 people in the smallest of the two groups that you're comparing. In practicality, as every one of you would likely acknowledge, that is really rare. From what I have seen in all of the many analyses I've done, it's a handful of jobs actually meet that particular requirement. The bulk of them are far too small sample size, which is one of the reasons that the OFCCP wanted employers to begin trying to group people into larger pay analysis groups. And so, but the reason being is multiple regression requires a fairly substantial sample size, and the larger the sample size, the better. Now, I ran many analyses where the number of people in the overall pay analysis group was 20, and so I would go as low as 20 with at least 5 in the smallest comparison group. So I even was like extra liberal in including people, and still the vast majority of jobs weren't appropriate for use with multiple regression. Another assumption is this thing called homoscedasticity. Multiple regression assumes that that the relationship between your explanatory factors and compensation is equal along the entire pay range. Now, what do I mean by that? Essentially, what it's saying is that that time in company makes has the very same impact on pay at the lower end of the pay range as it does in the higher end of the pay range. And that actually isn't true. If you think about it, there may be people at the lower end of the pay range who are, they may have a lot of time in company, but their pay is substantially lower than someone who was, say, an executive or someone else who is at the high end of the pay range, and they came in fairly recently. So in other words, this assumption of this thing we call homoscedasticity is often not met. And I'm not going to go, this isn't really intended to be a statistical lecture, so I'm not going to go too much into that. There's also an assumption of this thing called no extreme multicollinearity, which is a fancy term for saying that your explanatory factors aren't super highly correlated, and that you have these things called normally distributed residuals. Now, again, I'm not going to go into all that stuff. The point I want to make is that regression, as powerful as it is, it's easy to fool yourself into thinking that you're covered because you go run a regression analysis and it says everything is fine. But in reality, unless all these things line up and are true, you really can't have confidence in your results. So ultimately, multiple regression, I don't think worked as well as it could, and here's why. Let me ask you this question. How often is the sample size questionable when analyzing a given job or pay analysis group? Consider your own data. I'll bet you that your answer is almost all the time the sample size is questionable. In other words, they're small sample sizes. How often do analysts make do with whatever variables are convenient or easily gathered? Yeah, I can get time in company, and I can get time in grade, and wow, I can get education, but I'm missing a lot of education for some people, so I'm going to have missing data there. Job performance, it's kind of iffy. So what we do is we end up getting things like age, time in job, time in company, but we leave out a lot of the various things that we know have impact. And so how often do contractors wish they had data on variables they know is critical but is not available? So, man, I really wish I had amount of previous relevant experience. That would really impact pay. Or I wish I had previous salary, because that certainly impacts my own compensation setting decisions on my end. So because we don't have the data that we'd like, and we make do with the data that we have, clearly we're violating an assumption of linear regression. We're not including all relevant variables. We're not excluding all irrelevant variables. And then finally, how often do HR professionals, and I'm going to say consultants as well, really examine whether or not the data and the analyses that they run really meet the other assumptions with respect to multiple regression? And I can tell you it's not very often. So know this. Regression was never designed to prove that a variable is not related to a dependent variable. It's designed to identify the factors that do predict something, to create a model for prediction. Now think about it. What we're typically doing when we run a compensation analysis, in the past with multiple regression, is we gather these variables that we think predict pay, and then we throw gender in there, or ethnicity or minority status in there, and then we try to say whether or not that gender or minority status is statistically significant, we try to use that as evidence that gender or minority status, in fact, do not impact pay. So the important thing to be aware of is that that's really not what multiple regression is designed to do. It's not designed to tell you that this variable isn't related to pay. Instead, you're just trying to come up with the best model to explain pay that you can. And the reason that's important is I have found many, many times in my analyses, if not in every analysis, that it's not uncommon for the significance of an explanatory factor to change with the addition of more explanatory factors. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that I can have a job where gender is related to pay. And so that, on the face of it, that looks like a problem because gender shouldn't be the thing that is explaining pay. So I run a multiple regression analysis, and in addition to gender, I include time and company. And then gender suddenly is not statistically significant. And so what that, traditionally what I would say is, controlling for time and company, gender no longer contributes to pay. And then I like wave my hands and say, woohoo, you know, I've explained this apparent difference in pay by gender. But then I include job performance. And then suddenly gender is statistically significant again. And then I include education. And now gender is not statistically significant. And so in other words, the factors, whether or not they're statistically significant, all depends on what you stick in your model. And so as a result, it's actually possible to sort of shape your analysis so that, and I probably talked about this in a second, no, actually it is there, that we shape the analysis. We don't do it consciously, but you can. You know, I would ask you, like, suppose, especially if there are any consultants on the phone, have you ever, like, you're running your model and then you include a variable and suddenly say gender is significant, you're like, oops, don't include that one. And so the final model, it excludes a variable that would have made gender look statistically significant. And you can see it's all odd, and part of it is because we're not meeting the fundamental assumptions of multiple regression, which is all legitimate variables are accounted for, all irrelevant variables are excluded. So that takes me to why the OFCCP's new scheduling letter and item 19 may actually be better for contractors. So first off, as I was mentioning previously, the focus is on specific ethnic groups, and that clarifies, that helps you to identify where the real disparities are found. Now, when there are disparities, it's likely to involve fewer people because, as I mentioned again previously, you know, when you break people into the individual ethnic groups, now you're talking about smaller, more discrete groups of people. The statistical techniques used are in many ways a lot more straightforward, or I might even say more appropriate to the task of really analyzing these smaller groups. And so finally, while the previous analytical strategy really seemed very scientific, you know, it really didn't do anything to address where the real pain lies. Now, again, I can't speak for everyone, but the clients I've worked with, I can give them a fancy statistical report, but in the end, it all comes down to an analyst or HR professional or compensation professional looking at the data, trying to, you know, do a cohort analysis, and that takes a lot of the time. It's frustrating, and in some organizations, it's a challenge because nobody wants to own that particular problem. And so, you know, all the statistics and scientific analysis in the world really aren't going to help with that endpoint that is perhaps the most time-consuming and resource-intensive part of the whole thing. So ultimately, just remember that whatever analytical strategy you use, it all is going to come down to, you know, a cohort analysis where you're going to be looking at, are similarly qualified employees, are they in fact, are the pay differences that you observe, do they appear to be legitimate, and if not, how to adjust their pay. And so this is where the pain lies, and so this is one of the reasons that in my own analytical strategy, I have tried to build a process to make that as easy as possible and to take some of that pain out of the analysis. So let's talk about how then to analyze compensation under item 19. So the requirement, as we've mentioned again previously, is we're focusing on the individual group level. So for gender, nothing really changes because you've only got 2 groups to start with. The real change is going to be with ethnicity, because now typically what you're going to be looking at is comparing 5 separate groups. So this is a requirement. So the first kind of knee-jerk response that I have heard is that, people would say, well, then what we need to do is we just need to run a bunch of t-tests or sign ranks test or some other test to compare every group with each other. So we can compare each ethnic group to each other to find out, where any statistically significant differences lie. Another knee-jerk response, which is slightly more appropriate, is to say, all right, I'm going to jump immediately to doing t-tests or sign rank tests or some other test statistic. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare each of the lesser paid groups to whoever makes more, because that's really the big question is who gets the most and how do others compare to that. So what I'll do is I'll run these tests to compare the favored group to the lesser paid groups to try and identify whether or not there's any statistically significant differences. And my warning to you is both of these approaches are absolutely incorrect. And if you do either of those knee-jerk responses, it's almost surely going to result in inaccurate findings. And let me explain why. It all comes down to this thing called alpha inflation. And this is a statistical term that refers to, kind of what happens when you make multiple comparisons with the same data. So here's the situation. When you compare 2 groups and find a statistically significant difference, essentially, you have to keep in mind you have not proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that that difference is real, that it's not a statistical artifact, just a fluke event of the data. You haven't proven that that is actually true. What you're saying is that it appears to be true, but there's still a 5% chance that that difference was purely due to random chance, okay? This is true in all scientific research. This is when they say it's statistically significant, essentially what they're saying is, yeah, what I found is almost surely true, but there's still a chance that it's not true, and that chance is 5%. So every time you compare 2 groups, like say males and females, and you say it's statistically significant, generally speaking, you're saying, yeah, it's probably different, but there's also a 5% chance that really there's no true difference going on. Okay, so we're all comfortable with that. But what happens is when you conduct multiple comparisons on the same data, such as whites versus blacks, whites versus Hispanics, whites versus Asians, whites versus Native Americans, notice you're no longer making just 2 comparisons. Now you're making, in this case, 4 comparisons. Now, what does that mean? Your actual chance of finding a difference that doesn't really exist, but it's just sort of you happen to win the lottery and find the weird thing, it increases with each additional comparison, and that's called alpha inflation. And so essentially it looks something like this. Your error rate is going to increase with the number of comparisons that you make. So if you compare, if all you're doing is comparing, say, whites versus minorities, all minorities, and if you find a difference, there's still a 5% chance that you didn't find that the difference isn't real. In other words, there's a 95% chance that the difference is in fact a real thing. But now if we extend that, we say, well, we're going to compare whites versus blacks. That's a one comparison. There's a 5% chance we're finding something by chance. Then we compare whites versus Hispanics. Now we're making 2 comparisons. So we actually have a 5% chance of error with each comparison, which gives us a 10% chance of finding something that doesn't really exist. 3 pairs, 15%, 4 pairs, 20%. So if all you did was jump in and run a bunch of sign rank tests or t-tests comparing each ethnic group, in this case just to the favored group, now you could potentially find what appears to be a statistically significant difference, and yet you have a 20% chance that that difference didn't really exist. It was just a function of running multiple comparisons. So some other concerns before selecting a statistical test you should be aware of beyond this issue of alpha inflation, which I'll address momentarily. First off is sample size. The way statistics works is if your sample size is too small, statistics just become useless because they are based on probability distributions, and you need to have a large enough sample size to be able to make these kinds of comparisons. You can run a statistical test like in Excel or SPSS, even on very, very small data sets, and it'll give you a result, but that result is basically worthless. And so you need to be aware of sample size when you're running your statistical test. You need to be aware of the assumptions associated with the statistical test. We talked about assumptions earlier with multiple regression, and there's some other assumptions as well we'll talk about with other tests that I recommend using for the current situation. Statistical power. Statistical power refers basically to, how powerful your test is going to be in finding differences should they exist. Robustness or flexibility. Some statistical tests are kind of like Humvees, they can go over any terrain. You can throw just about any data in them. Some statistical tests are more like a high-performance sports car, that they're much more picky about what goes into them in order to get any kind of valid result. So you want to find a statistic that is appropriately robust. So what is the appropriate strategy for analyzing compensation for ethnic groups? So now I'm going to begin describing my thought process on this and the process that I go through. So the first step is, before you jump into analyzing individual ethnic groups, you need to find some way of analyzing the entire group of employees by ethnicity in such a way that will avoid alpha inflation. And there is, in fact, a way to do that. Once you do that, then identify the favored group. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to go back to one here. So let's say we run this analysis, which I'll describe in a moment, and we found that there was a statistically significant difference somewhere among these 5 ethnic groups. The next step would be to identify the favored group in your particular job title or pay analysis group, and then you would compare all of the lesser paid groups to the favored group. Now, how is this different from simply running the analysis I talked about before, where you just run a statistical test with the favored group comparing to all the individual ethnic groups? The difference is step 1. When you run that, and again, it's analysis I'll talk about in a moment, when you run a single analysis that takes everybody into account at once, in one single analysis, the result is it tells you somewhere among these ethnic groups you can hang your hat on the fact that there is, in fact, a difference. So in other words, you've confirmed somewhere in here there's a difference. And so now when you go and you run your tests comparing the favored group with each of the individual ethnic groups, you at least know that you're looking for something that appears to be real. And so you don't have the same issue. There's a bit of an issue, but you don't have the same issue with alpha inflation that you had before. And that's the appropriate approach to analyze more than 2 groups, such as in ethnicity. So once if your sample size permits, you run statistical analyses. Whether or not there's a statistically significant difference, you're still going to have to assess relevant explanatory variables to determine whether any differences statistically or significant differences, does it pass the smell test? So what I'm saying by that is because frequently we're going to be dealing with sample sizes that are too small for things like multiple regression, what it falls back on is you find a statistically significant difference, then you're going to have to go and take a look at the explanatory factors that you include in your analysis and do kind of like an eyeball multiple regression, and you're going to have to determine, okay, well, I found a statistically significant difference. Does it make sense or not based on the pattern of explanatory factors in my data? And I'll show you an example of that in just a bit. And then ultimately, you're going to have to do a cohort analysis, focusing primarily, but as I note, with exceptions, on those groups where you have uncovered statistically significant differences that cannot be explained either by statistics or explanatory factors. And then you adjust pay as necessary. So let's take a look at this. Let's break it down into a little more detail. Step 1 in an analysis is you have to ask yourself, are there more than 2 groups? In this case, we're looking at ethnicity. There are 5 ethnic groups. So when you're analyzing more than 2 groups, there are a number of statistical tests that you can use. One type of statistical test is called a one-way analysis of variance, or ANOVA for short. This is a test that's specifically designed to compare average scores on more than 2 groups. So it's perfect for analyzing pay by ethnic group. There's one called a Kruskal-Wallis non-parametric equivalent of a one-way ANOVA. I'll talk about the difference between Kruskal-Wallis and one-way ANOVA in just a second, but be aware they're both designed to do the same thing. The Kruskal-Wallis is designed to compare more than 2 groups. There's another test called a median test, K samples, and the K stands for simply however many groups you have. So you could say, in our case, it would be a median test, 5 samples, because we have 5 ethnic groups, pooled median. Now, these tests, as I said, are specifically designed to identify differences among groups, among more than 2 groups, without increasing alpha error. So this is kind of that step 1 when you're trying to determine, is there a difference somewhere among my groups? These are the kinds of tests you would use. But which one? Should I use an ANOVA or a Kruskal-Wallis, median test? What should I do? Well, let's take a look at that a little more in detail. So ANOVA is a very common statistical test that's used in a whole variety of things to compare more than 2 groups. The key point to be aware of is it's what's called a parametric statistic. By parametric, what I mean is it relies on the mean and the standard deviation. So, you know, the analysis of variance part of ANOVA, the V for variance, what that does is it analyzes the amount of variation within various groups, and it requires the mean and essentially the standard deviation to do that. Now, the problem with that is whenever you deal with small sample sizes, the average and the standard deviation get to be virtually useless because a single score that's kind of out of the norm, you don't have a normal distribution, and it just messes everything up. And again, this isn't designed to be so much of a statistical talk as just kind of point some of these key things out. So, but when your data meet the assumptions, if you have a large enough sample, this is an awesome statistical test to use. So as I was saying, it works by partitioning total variance into within groups and between groups variance. And so what it essentially does is it compares the ratio of amount of variation within each ethnic group to the amount of variation between each ethnic group, and it determines whether or not the difference between those groups is therefore statistically significant. It's more powerful than the Kruskal-Wallis and the median test. But again, it's more powerful, but it requires your data to meet certain requirements. One nice thing about this thing called ANOVA is it includes precise post hoc tests. Now, what do I mean by post hoc tests? As I mentioned previously, like if you run an analysis of variance comparing pay for each of 5 ethnic groups, the first thing ANOVA will do is it'll tell you whether or not, yep, there's some difference somewhere among these 5 ethnic groups. But the great thing about ANOVA is that it kind of comes packaged with these things called post hoc tests, which once you find a difference, these tests are available to help you identify exactly where the difference or differences lie. So that's a really useful thing with ANOVA. It has some more explicit data assumptions because, again, you're using the mean and the standard deviation, and if your data, if the mean and the standard deviation make no sense really given your data, then this is not appropriate. And it's affected greatly by small sample sizes, which we typically have. So ANOVA, as powerful as it is, it's probably not appropriate in most cases for the analyses that we do. So that leaves us with the Kruskal-Wallis or the median test. These also are specifically designed to compare 2 or more groups. They're non-parametric, which means they don't rely on averages and standard deviations. And so as a result, they're kind of like the Humvee. They're what are called distribution-free statistics. They're not impacted so much by outliers, things like that. They work by comparing actual ranks for each person in a group. Now they are a little less powerful, but again, it's all trade-offs. They're less powerful, but they're more appropriate. You can conceive of post hoc tests afterwards, which I'll talk about in a bit, but they're not nearly as good as ANOVA. There are fewer assumptions on your data, and so they're more robust, and they're less affected by small sample sizes, which ultimately is our situation. So as a result, in my opinion, I believe that the Kruskal-Wallis and or the median test is probably the best overall choice. If you are using ANOVA, these post hoc tests that I mentioned, there are several choices, and these different choices of post hoc tests, what they do is they help you to, you can choose how much risk of alpha error or alpha inflation are you willing to accept. Because as I mentioned, the more comparisons you make between groups, the greater the probability that you're going to end up with alpha inflation, or you're going to end up with differences that don't really exist. So what you can do with these post hoc tests is you can say, well, I'm willing to accept X amount of risk that I find something that doesn't exist. And you'll notice that I have Tukey's honestly significant difference test highlighted in green, because when I run an analysis of variance, I use Tukey's, because what it does is it raises the bar necessary to find a statistically significant difference just enough to kind of account for this alpha inflation, but it's not overly conservative so that you never find any differences at all. But again, I don't think, my own opinion is analysis of variance probably isn't the tool to use in most cases in our analyses. Instead, if you're using a Kruskal-Wallis test or median test, what I do in my own analyses is if I find a difference for a particular job title, I then turn around and I run a Mann-Whitney-U test and a Kolmogorov-Smirnov test, which are non-parametric tests, comparing each of the lesser paid groups to the favored group, and with the confidence that somewhere in there should be a difference. You can also use the signed rank test to do the same, but I use the Mann-Whitney and the Kolmogorov-Smirnov. So if a specific ethnic group is different, if difference is found, then what? So I ran my analysis using either ANOVA or a Kruskal-Wallis. I found that there's a difference. Then what do I do? Well, if your sample size is large enough to support a valid analysis, by all means, go and run a multiple regression analysis. But when I do this, I follow the original requirements of the OFCCP, which is, I have to have at least 30 people in my job group or my pay analysis group, and at least 5 people in the smallest of the 2 groups. Because it's not worth running an analysis like this just because. You want to do it when it's appropriate. If the gender or ethnic variable is still significant after a regression analysis, follow up with a cohort analysis, which you're probably going to have to do anyway. If sample size is too small for a regression analysis, you're really going to have to rely on the cohort analysis to try to determine whether any statistically significant differences are legitimate or not. Now, gender, when you're comparing 2 groups, you do have the option of go ahead and just do what you've been doing in the past, which is running t-tests and multiple linear regression. But as hopefully I've pointed out, because we deal with such small sample sizes, I just don't think that the t-tests and the multiple regression are appropriate in the vast majority of cases. And beyond that, it seems kind of odd to have a kind of a completely different analytical strategy for gender as opposed to ethnic group, although you could do that. But what I do is when comparing 2 groups, as in gender, there are a couple of statistical tests that are designed for comparing 2 groups. One is the Mann-Whitney-U, one is the Kolmogorov-Smirnov. Now you'll notice that I mentioned those in the previous slide, where I was saying if I found a statistically significant difference using the Kruskal-Wallis that tells me somewhere, among those ethnic groups there was a difference, then I would run the Mann-Whitney-U and the Kolmogorov-Smirnov test to do a bunch of 2-group comparisons, comparing the favored group with the lesser paid groups. Well, here I'm not having to use the Kruskal-Wallis or the median test because I only have 2 groups, and so I'm perfectly safe just jumping to the Mann-Whitney-U and Kolmogorov-Smirnov test to run these comparisons. So if I find a statistically significant difference with either of these tests, then I flag it as statistically significant. Now, there are other tests. You could use the signed rank test to do the same thing. You could do what we've done in the past and use an independent sample t-test. But as we've seen in the past, even though we ran independent samples t-tests on groups as small as, I ran them personally on groups as small as you had at least 6 people in the job title or pay analysis group and at least 3 people in each group, well, I'd run an independent samples t-test. Technically, that's not appropriate. the sample size is just too small to use that. And so, you know, I think there are a lot of things we did because we were trying to comply with the OFCCP, but, you know, it was focusing on compliance rather than necessarily doing it right, because that's what they said to do, and that was the industry practice. So these tests, except for t-tests, are non-parametric. So the Mann-Whitney-U, Kolmogorov, Smirnov, signed ranks, they don't rely on the mean or standard deviation, so they're appropriate in the majority of settings. I ran a test where, with one client's data, I ran the Mann-Whitney-U and the Kolmogorov-Smirnov test and an independent samples t-test just to kind of see what the results would pan out like. And essentially, I got the same results. There were some differences, but when I took a look at the output in SPSS, which is the statistical package I used, I found that the t-test, it generated statistical results which were clearly nonsensical because most of the data that goes into the output was nonsensical itself. So it was like you put data into something and you can run a test and it'll give you a result, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's appropriate. Which kind of leads me to, and I think I talk more about this later, but I think it's an important issue because of the amount of work that is involved in running these analyses. There's a tendency to want to automate everything. And I'm increasingly convinced that there are some things you can automate, but statistical analysis isn't one of them. Because, you know, really, for a statistician, if you're running an analysis, you spend time looking at your data and you ask yourself, given my sample size, given the shape of the distribution, given these other circumstances, what's the appropriate test to use in this particular case? It would be like, you know, taking your car to the shop and they try to do everything with a pair of pliers. You know, sometimes you want them to use the right tool for the job to make sure everything is right. And so that's one of the reasons that what I try to do is automate everything I can, but I just don't automate the statistical analysis because and that's why I run multiple statistical tests, because I want to, you know, see what's going on. So what does an analysis look like? I'm going to show you how I analyze compensation in the hopes that maybe it'll give you some sense of how you might do it, and to, you know, just basically maybe it'll make some more sense to you what I'm talking about. So the way I do it is I follow this pattern. These are kind of some buzzwords that I use in my own development process: is analyze, summarize, visualize. So I run my various analyses. I create a summary report that summarizes what I can in an automated fashion. I visualize it with my goal in visualization is to try to create reports that are super easy for the end user, something that they don't have to think too much about once they kind of get the gist of it. I use built-in logic to try to help identify potential problems rather than just present a report. I conduct statistical analyses, trying to use the appropriate statistics for the job. But even then, because of the fact we're dealing with small sample sizes, sometimes you might find a statistical analysis or find statistical significance, you know, and you have to look at it and say, you know what, the software spit that out, but it's just not appropriate because of this, that, or the other. So I always go through after the statistical analysis, and I may flag that something is statistically significant, but I make a judgment call as to whether or not it's statistically even appropriate or relevant. And then finally, I generate a cohort analysis summary report in the hopes that it'll provide information in a way that will help people get to the bottom of why these differences were observed. So step one in my analysis is that basically you gather your data. It's interesting to note, whereas in the past, like I say, almost all of my analyses were, you know, annualized compensation. Now the OFCCP, ideally they'd like total compensation, because ultimately it's what a person takes home that makes all the difference. But from my experience, total compensation isn't as easy as it sounds, especially with larger corporations, because they may have a whole bunch of different pay codes, and so it can be kind of complicated to create. Annual rate, annualized compensation, overtime, bonus, incentive, stock, all these things are potential compensation measures. Now what I do when I run an analysis is I've built a system where I can analyze up to 10 separate measures of compensation. And I analyze them separately to look at whether or not there's a statistically significant difference in any one of them. Because total compensation is really made up of things like annual rate, overtime, bonus, stock. So in a lot of ways, this is kind of like a compensation equivalent of a step analysis that's done in the selection process. So then the next step is to gather your compensation drivers or your explanatory factors. These are kind of the typical things you would use in a multiple regression analysis, such as time on job, time and grade, years of service, highest degree, job performance, things like that. So you gather those. Now, once you have your data, the next step is to select your unit of analysis. And so what do I mean by that? Essentially, the employer's judgment, through the employer's judgment and a knowledge of their compensation system, they need to create whatever unit of analysis they're going to use. And what I mean by that is, are you going to look at things by job title, by pay grade, by some pay analysis group? This isn't, I'm not going to go into that because I know we've talked about that in the industry for years now, what this means. I typically say my personal preference is that it's hard to get more appropriate than comparing people in the same job title, because technically they have the same NQs, they do the same thing, they have the same level of supervision. So in my mind, job title is probably optimal. But the downside of that is you have limited sample size. So whatever you use, you identify your unit of analysis. Ultimately, you just have to keep in mind that the OFCCP's ultimate question is basically whether similarly qualified employees who are performing highly similar work are being paid equitably. So whatever unit of analysis you use, I think it's important that you keep that in mind. Are you either helping or hindering answering that question? It seems like it's a simple thing to ask, but the problem is that, as everyone knows, whenever you try combining different groups to increase your sample size, you always compromise how similarly situated they are. So it really is a judgment call on the employer's part. So once you do that, the next step is to identify what I call high impact drivers of pay. What do I mean by high impact? Essentially, back when I said, okay, after you've identified your measures of pay, you identify your pay drivers or explanatory factors, you know that not all of those explanatory factors really have the same impact on pay. In a multiple regression analysis, ideally, what multiple regression does is it calculates coefficients that take into account the various weights that each predictor has. But since really multiple regression is almost never appropriate in our smaller groups, we don't have that luxury. So, but still, I think it's appropriate, if you want to, is to identify which of these variables has the most impact on pay. There are two ways to do it. Again, employer's judgment based on a thorough knowledge of your compensation system. So, for example, you may know as an employer that time and job is one of the biggest determinants of a person's compensation in that job. And you may know that job performance is one of the most powerful things you consider. Well, in that case, isn't it appropriate to acknowledge that in your analysis? So you can either do it based on judgment, or the other approach is empirically based. So to simply run a correlation between each pay driver and measure of compensation, and then based on the results of that correlation, if the relationship between that explanatory factor or pay driver and pay is greater than some set amount, then you would just say, I determine then that particular variable is having a significant impact on pay. So here's kind of what it looks like. You'll notice across the top, I have total compensation, annual rate, incentive bonus, and stock in dollars. And then down the left, you can see time and grade, time and job, service years, highest degree, job performance, and years of experience. And you can see that the correlations between each of those variables and each measure in pay is there. And you'll see that some of them are highlighted in red. Now, these are ones that I look at and I say, okay, I'm going to make a judgment call based on the size of these correlation coefficients as to which ones are, really significant. And I look at that and I might say something to the effect of, wow, time and grade is pretty high, time and job is pretty high, service years is high, and job performance. All right, so I might just say, all right, these four variables are high impact variables, if there's a difference, if the lesser paid group has more of any of these than the higher paid group, that's going to be kind of a warning flag to me. And you'll see how I apply that here in a moment. And so what I do is the first thing I do is I generate a summary report. And I use this with a proprietary system that I built called ISAC, which is Intelligent System for Analyzing Contractor Compensation. And basically my system generates a pivot table that arrays data. I identify the favored group. I calculate the difference in pay between each of the lesser paid groups and the favored group. And then I do something, I compare the pattern of individual pay drivers between the favored group and the lesser paid groups, and I color code them, as you'll see in just a second, so you can see where problems exist. Then I assess statistical significance, and then finally I generate a cohort warning, as you'll see in a second, which basically tells you, hey, I think this is something you really need to take a look at. Here's an example of my summary report, and it looks like a pivot table, which is what it is, although it has some special formatting to it. And so let's kind of dig into it. And the reason I'm showing this to you is you can always kind of create something similar to this yourself. So notice the first thing I do is someone can look at this and just immediately you can see which group is the favored group. You don't have to look at any data. It just says, here's the favored group. And the next thing it does is it identifies any comparison group. In this case, it's only females, but if it was minority group, to the extent you had people in each minority group, you would see the percent difference in between each of those groups and whoever the favored group is. So that's just quickly by looking down through these, you can easily identify that. You can see the measures of pay that are listed here on the left under count, and you can see there's color coding there, which I'll talk about in a second. And you can see the explanatory factors that are listed here below that. Okay, so let's take a look at the explanatory factors. These are the pay drivers. Notice under female that some of them are red and some of them are yellow and some of them are green. Well, wherever you see red, basically throughout all my reports, I use kind of a standardized format. Red is bad, yellow is warning, green's pretty good, or it's okay. Now, in this case, whenever you see red in a group, what that's telling you is that that lesser paid group is higher or has more of that particular factor than the favored group. So in this particular case, here we have females who are paid 8.01% less than males, and yet they have 6.2 years in grade compared to males who have 1.0 years in grade, and that's a high priority or a high impact factor. So that's really worth noting because we know that time and grade based on our decision tree, that really carries a lot in terms of why people get the pay they get. Excuse me. Yellow. Now, this also indicates when a lesser paid group has more of or is higher on a factor than the favored group, but it's not a high impact or a high impact factor. So basically, it's a bad thing, but it's not as bad. And then lastly, whenever you see green, that's telling you that the lesser paid group is equal to or lower than the favored group, which means, yeah, that makes sense. They're paid less and they also have, lower performance or lower years of service, things like that. So that's a quick way you can make some sense out of it. Now, so again, every time you see red, bad, green, good, and yellow is kind of a warning. So what you want to see is you want to see all green. Or you're going to occasionally see a yellow here and there, but what you really want to see, you don't want to see, is a lot of red and yellow. Because if that particular group has a lot of red or yellow in it, it's clearly indicative that something doesn't seem quite right here. Okay, let's take a look at break this report down a little bit more. Now, you'll notice here in column G, there's something I call problem flags or problem factors. Now, what this does is it's another quick way of, even though you can glance at the pattern of explanatory factors that I showed you, like under female, you can see reds and greens and yellows. What the problem factor does is it actually counts the number of explanatory factors that the lesser paid group has that are more than the favored group. And so obviously what you want is a 0 there, which means that the lesser paid group had, never had more of any of your factors. The larger that number is, the greater the significance. And so you'll see it's kind of shaded in sort of a pinkish red type of thing, which is kind of, sort of a warning here. So again, it's something that you can quickly look at rather than having to look at the data itself. You can say, oh, wow, here's a job, general auditor 2, females make 8.01% less than males. Dang, they actually have a lot more, or they have more of a couple of our high impact explanatory factors. Or you could also just look at problem factors and say, oh, females have 3 explanatory factors that exceed those of males, and or of the favored group, which in this case is male. And so it's another quick way to kind of gauge how big of a problem this is. Now then you'll notice the next column, column H, is where I identify whether or not I found statistically a significant difference. Now this is where I do this manually because, well, first off, the statistical tests that I'm proposing using, you can program them into Excel, but they're not native to Excel. They're pretty common tests, and they're in most advanced statistical packages, but they're not in Excel. And so I run all of my statistical analyses separately, and then once I've determined whether or not there was a statistically significant difference, I flag that here. And so again, highlighted in red, statistically significant. Now, when I find a statistically significant difference, you'll notice here in column B that I highlight those particular compensation variables where I found that difference. So again, just at a glance, you can see which compensation variables, where the problem lies. If you see red, it means there was a statistically significant difference between groups on that variable. And if you see green, it means that there was no statistically significant difference. If there's no shading at all, it means that the statistic couldn't be computed because the sample size was too small or something like that. And so finally, taking into account all of this information, the size of the difference between the favored group and any of the lesser paid groups, the pattern of explanatory factors, whether or not there was statistically significant difference calculated, the number of factors or problem factors that were observed. What I do is I identify a cohort alert, which can be either very high, high, medium, low, or very low. And so what that's intended to do is to say, all right, based on this information, this particular pay analysis group or job title, you need to dig deeper into this. And so that's kind of how my summary report itself works. Once I do that summary report, I do all these analyses, and I apply the correct statistical test to the job. I run a cohort analysis, simplifying the process. So my goal here has been, based on my experience and knowing that people find this particularly challenging and time-consuming, I tried to build an analysis to take some of the pain out of this. And so for each employee and each job title or pay analysis group, I present their raw data on each pay variable and each pay driver or factor. This is something that's pretty common that everybody does this, I think. I calculate z-scores for each of these variables, which again is something very common on analyses. I identify medium or high outliers for the primary pay variable. So the way my system is designed currently is I've designed it around identifying outliers for whatever that top variable is, because it's total compensation. But if it's not total compensation, whichever the primary variable that someone identifies is what their focus is, I identify high, medium, or low outliers on that variable. I calculate what are called pay warnings based on the number of pay drivers or explanatory factors that don't support this excessively high or low level of pay. And then I generate these things I call cohort matching flags, which are designed to help an analyst or HR professional quickly identify groups of people within a particular job title or pay analysis group whose explanatory factors are similar. So in other words, it helps you build a cohort. So rather than kind of guessing and looking around, you can find people who are similar and then kind of look at how their pay is. And I'll show you that in just a second. Now this is an example of what my Isaac cohort report. And I need to clear my throat here, please excuse me. Okay, looking at this report, you'll see again some color coding stuff going on, and I need to break this down for you. There's a lot more information here, but this is the first thing people see when they look at my cohort analysis. There's more information available, but this is kind of a summary. The first thing you'll notice is the color. Notice that the job title, the color of it indicates the cohort warning level. So in other words, if you see red, that red matches the level of warning. It was either high or very high from the compensation analysis report. So it's easy to kind of page down and see where problems are. Then the second column, which is unshaded, this is the primary, this is the type of analysis I was running, gender. But you'll notice in the shaded column, I also provide ethnicity. Now, one of the things I've complained about in the past when I've run analyses is that you know that if you find a statistically significant difference by gender and you make a change, you know that that's going to impact what's likely to appear in your ethnic analysis. And so I wanted to provide the ethnic grouping so that you can see, you know, okay, well, look, you know, this person is significantly low paid, they're a female. You know, and they're Asian, and here we have a male who is, you know, lower paid, and, you know, they're African American. For what it's worth, it's important, I think, understand the context of, you're not just talking about gender, you're talking about an employee, and their ethnicity is part of them. The second thing I want to point out is you'll notice in column AA and AB, you'll see it says problem level. Now, problem level is composed of two things, an outlier warning and a pay warning. Now, an outlier warning basically tells you how far above or below that particular employee is from the mean. And so if an employee is either greater than or less than 1.5 standard deviations away from the mean, they get a median. If they're more than 1.96 standard deviations away from the mean, which is kind of the level we consider statistical significance, it gets a high. And the plus and the minus, that tells you at a glance, is this person paid above or below the average? So here we have someone who is, they're a medium outlier, which means that they're more than 1.5 standard deviations above the mean, and it's above, I can tell that from the plus. So that's part one. Part two is in column AB, where it says pay warning. Now this requires a little bit of explanation, because this is essentially a count of how many explanatory factors this particular person has that don't support their primary compensation measure. So, and the way it works is if your pay, well, I have a slide on this in a second. It's kind of difficult to explain, but this is really important because this is like the meat. This gives you a sense of how big a problem is this. Because if this number is 0, what it's telling you is this employee's data all seems to support their particular level of pay. But the greater the number is, the more questionable it is. And so in this case, the number 7 indicates, since it's way above 0, it's telling you that this person is, you know, paid substantially more than 1.5 standard deviations above average. However, their pay drivers don't support that. And so it gives you a reason to really take a look and try to find out what's going on. Now here's the logic behind those pay warnings. If you have a high impact factor like time and grade, and we identified that as being this is one of those primary things that drives pay, if a high impact explanatory factor is less than 0.75, okay, so we're talking about people who are paid way lower than average. Okay, so we're talking about someone who is paid, you know, they're a negative outlier. If their time and grade is greater than 0.75, a standard deviation of 0.75, in other words, their time and grade doesn't support that low of pay, rather than getting a 1 in that variable, they get a 2. So in other words, it weights this particular explanatory factor that if it doesn't support a person's pay, it gets a score of 2. If a regular explanatory, such as, say, previous experience, because it's kind of hard to get that, we didn't flag it as a high priority, if that explanatory factor is greater than a negative 0.75, it still doesn't support the person's low pay, but we just flag it with a 1. So in this way, if someone's explanatory factor doesn't support their particular level of pay, and it's high impact, we give that extra weight. Same thing is true with positive outliers, except in this case, you've got someone who is paid really high, and if their various explanatory factors are low, they get either a 1 or 2 based on whether or not it's a high impact factor. So as I say below, the general idea is that an employee's pay is exceptionally high or exceptionally low, then those factors that drive pay should also tend to be much higher or lower than average. It's not going to always be true because there are other factors that impact pay, but it's probably the way to bet. So let's take a look at this now. The last thing I want to show you about my cohort matcher is this thing I call it the cohort matcher. You'll notice that 3 of the variables are highlighted in yellow: time and grade, service years, and job performance. Now what that's telling you is those 3 variables were considered high impact. So we give more weight to those than pretty much anything else. And so the premise of this is what I've done is I've grouped people by where they fall on the normal distribution. And I'll show you the logic for that in a second. So, but the point of the matter is like if you look in the very first row in row 8, you'll see that that person has a 3 in time and grade. Everybody who has a similar time and grade to that person, not exact, but similar, they fall, and I think in this case, that everyone who has a z-score of between +1 and +2 gets a 3. So, +1 +2 gets a 3. So what this does is it grabs a larger group of people. So if you select everyone who has a 3, the result is that you're able to gather a group of people who have similar time and grade, i.e. a cohort of similar individuals with respect to time and grade. And so you can select more and more of these explanatory factors to craft as similarly situated group of people as you possibly can, and then you can compare their pay and try to determine what's going on with them. So here's the logic for it. I know I'm kind of running out of time here, so I need to kind of hurry up here. Is that the way my cohort matcher works, and you can see this in your slide that I sent you, is I use z-scores for each of the explanatory factors. So if a person's z-score, for example, for time and grade, is less than a -1, the flag for that variable is a 1. If the z-score for time and grade is a -1 but less than 0, it gets a 2. If it's a 0 to 1.0, it gets a 3. So what you can see is it grabs groups of people who are somewhat similar, and that actually helps you to build a profile of a target employee. So you can, if you look at a person and you can say they have a 3 for time and grade, they have a 2 for years of service, and they have a 5 for education, you can select filters to find people who are similar to that particular person. And that's the way the cohort matcher works. So I wanted to show you just briefly, let's see, how do I get to this? Oh, here it is. So this is kind of an example of what my analysis looks like. It's just like I showed you, you have your various variables here, and or your various, you can see your job title, and as you look down, you can see patterns. This one is ethnicity, whereas the one previously was for gender, and I use that because it would fit on the page more. But like as an example, you can see here for investment officer, the favored group was white. Hispanics had 7.5% less than white with average pay. Pacific Islanders, 4.9. African Americans, 2.3% less. You can see the pattern of explanatory factors is just like really crazy. African Americans who make 2.13% less, they actually have more of these high impact drivers than the favored group, and they even have some of the low impact drivers that are more, and you can see a count over here under problem factors. You can see that African Americans have 5 factors that are higher than the favored group. Pacific Islanders and Hispanics have 4 factors that are higher. However, the statistic told me that the difference was not statistically significant. And so here is where I apply, in the past, what you'd say, well, it's not statistically significant, we're good to go. What I do is I apply logic to that, and I say, looking at the pattern of things, I'm going to say that this is a medium cohort warning. Sure, you can hang your hat on statistical significance, but I certainly wouldn't pass this through. And you can see as you go down that in some cases you don't have very many. You have Hispanics and whites. You can't really calculate a statistical test with 4 and 1. So, in that case, you'll notice like down here, let me pass it here. Here we have Manager 2, Human Resources. Notice that the favored group is African American. Asian Pacific Islanders are 19% less. Whites are 16.41% less. And yet, the Asian Pacific Islanders and whites have greater job performance, and Asians particularly, they have more performance for 2012 and 2011. And so what you have to do is you apply a judgment call, and you say, like, all right, so African Americans have 8.7 years time in grade compared to Asian Pacific Islanders have 3.0, whites have 2.7. You kind of make comparisons like that, and you make a determination. What I do anyway is I go through and manually make a determination that is my best estimate based on looking at the data to analyze this, to kind of make an assessment of how significant it is to run this analysis. Now, because the difference is so great, I noted this as something high that I would want to look into, especially for Asian Pacific Islanders. But that is a subjective analysis that I run, which is worth me saying that one of the things that I try to do when clients want me to is I try to run these kind of high level, I don't just run the statistic, but I actually try to look at it and do the legwork to the extent that they want me to and that I can to try to ferret out problems and identify whether or not they're an issue rather than relying on, the client to actually do that. And so it's like trying to take some of the pain out of the follow-up analysis from being delivered the statistical report. Cohort analysis for ethnicity, it's exactly the same. And so, for example, again, you could say, I'm going to, let's say, job performance. This is fictitious data, so it's a little bit hard because you can tell I put in some records and then I duplicated them, and so it makes it a little bit more difficult because of the fact that I duplicated stuff to get it. But let's see, I can select Auditor 2, and then I can select my Cohort Matcher 2. And now what you can see is I actually would have a cohort of people who have similar time and grade. Because there's, I don't have a large sample size, I can't do a whole lot with this. But let's suppose, yeah, it's not really a good example. The idea is that you could actually then go and you could further refine. If you found a person that you wanted to find a cohort for, you would look at their explanatory factors and then you would select a cohort based on their pattern. So if I was interested, for example, in evaluating this particular male, I would say, well, part of the issue is this person maybe is missing their time and grade, where maybe if I had that, it would explain it. But what I would do is, with not having that, is I say, I want to find everybody who has a years of service of 3, which is that particular male, that's what they have. And so here's a cohort of people who have similar years of service. And so so in doing that, I could whittle things down so that in the end, I could compare people who are similar. The last thing I want to show you on this is note there is all this supporting information over here as well. Here are the Z-scores for each of the explanatory factors. Here are their raw scores. Here's their compensation variables, their employee ID, their, all of the variables are there. But the main thing to really focus on at first in terms of finding a cohort, identifying a problem, is to look at these. Select this again. And so, let's see, the job title. And so what you have here then is basically that cohort analysis is, you notice you don't see any red or yellow in this case over in job title because there were no significant things to look at. But you can see your outliers, your pay warnings, all that kind of stuff. So I'm running out of time, so unfortunately I'm going to have to wrap this up. So just in summary, so item 19 of the OFCCP's revised scheduling letter, it poses challenges, but it presents advantages. And I think those advantages really do lie on that focus on individual ethnic groups because it produces liabilities which will simplify the cohort analysis. I talked about more appropriate statistical tests and applying t-tests and regression to everything, regardless of whether the data meets the assumptions. I talked about to run the analysis correctly, you really can't avoid a customized approach. You know, automated approaches will fail to consider all available information. You know, they're nice to run, but they, especially when it comes to the analysis part of the statistical analysis, they're just not appropriate. Non-parametric tests generally result in the same results, but not exactly as parametric tests. But I would argue that unless the sample size is larger, the more appropriate. Statistical analysis, while important, will not answer all questions, especially when you're dealing with small sample sizes, because I use SPSS, the statistical package, and it will give you, it'll run a statistical analysis and tell you whether or not there's a statistically significant difference between two people. Well, that makes no sense when you're talking about statistics because it's based on groups. And since a qualitative analysis is unavoidable, it's important to create reports and processes that will facilitate it. And so that is essentially my presentation today. I've talked for just about an hour and a half. We have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to take a look and see if you have any questions. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me and talk to me. As I mentioned in my very first slide, that I just changed web hosts. So if you go to my website, you know, please don't use my email address or my forms there because I'm still working to get that working. But you can email me at my home address, which I included at the beginning, which is ohiggins@surewest.net, and I'll be able to try to answer any questions that you have. So thank you very much for your time. And let's see if there are any questions. Do you have there? I don't see any questions now at the moment. If you have any that I didn't address, I tried to be as clear as I could on it. But please let me know. And if you don't have any questions now, please reach out to me because I would be more than happy to discuss it. Advice is always free, and we're all part of the same community together. So thank you very much. I'll wait and see if there are any questions, and if not, I'll see you around cyberspace. Okay, I don't see any questions. So thank you again for your time. Have a pleasant day. And if you have any feedback for this presentation, I would sure welcome it. I'd like to know if it was clear, easy to understand, or if you have any suggestions on what you would like to see in reports, such as those that I present, I would really love to hear that as well. So thank you very much. Have a great day.